It often begins in the most ordinary of ways, but then, something arrives, something that will shatter the peace, irrevocably, an empty letter. The setting for this unfolding mystery was the town of Harmony Creek. The Miller family's home stood proudly on Elm Street. Living within those walls were the Millers, David, a hard-working architect, Sarah, a kind-hearted elementary school teacher, their two children, 16-year-old Jake and 10-year-old Emily. A belief that was about to be tested in the most horrifying way imaginable, delivering not just mail but a creeping dread that would seep into the very foundations of their lives. It began on a Tuesday. Sarah Miller found a plain white envelope, no stamp, no return address. Inside, a single blank sheet of paper. Confusion turned to unease. She tossed it, hoping to forget it. That night, the house felt different. Every creak amplified her fear. The empty letter had left an imprint, a silent question mark. It was the first pebble in an avalanche of the unexplained. The silence of that blank page was just the beginning. Exactly 1 week later, another envelope arrived, identical to the first, plain white. No return address, no stamp, just their name. This time a cold tendril of dread wrapped around her heart. Another perfectly blank sheet of paper. A pattern was emerging, a deliberate, silent communication that felt more menacing with each empty arrival. And then, the changes began. So subtle at first, they were almost imperceptible. Sarah's favorite blue coffee mug was suddenly on the top shelf. David's car keys were found on the mantelpiece. The children's toys were neatly arranged in a perfect line. The feeling of being watched became a constant companion. The house, their sanctuary, began to feel different, almost hostile. But the letters kept coming every Tuesday, each one a silent, empty scream. Another Tuesday dawned. The mail truck approached, a harbinger. Sarah watched the mailman, dread gripping the house. This was the third Tuesday, the third blank letter. There it was, another sterile white envelope. No stamp, no return address, just their name. Back in the kitchen, the envelope lay on the counter. He picked it up, tore it open. Inside, a single blank sheet. This was now a disturbing pattern. The emptiness was terrifying. What did it mean? The empty letter joined its predecessors, a collection of voiceless threats. It was the silence of anticipation. The disturbances in the Miller home escalated. It was no longer just misplaced items. Small, cherished items vanished, only to reappear in odd places, or not at all. Emily's doll disappeared, then reappeared on the sofa, its eyes staring blankly. Sarah felt unease while David tried to explain it away. David found his drawings subtly reshuffled each morning. The sense of invasion was palpable. Sarah questioned her memory, finding the spice rack rearranged. Together, these tiny things painted a picture of a reality being altered. The house, once their haven, felt like a shifting landscape. A photo album vanished. She didn't tell David, the self-doubt corrosive. Was something sinister unfolding within their home? The feeling of being watched intensified, evolving into a near-constant presence. It was no longer just a prickling on the skin but a certainty. But there was never anyone there. It was a psychological torment. Shadows seemed to lengthen and twist in unnatural ways. More than once, David would hear a faint scuffling sound from an adjoining room. The children were becoming more articulate about their fears. Sarah felt it most acutely. Sometimes, she would hear faint, almost inaudible whispers. The house was no longer just a structure. It was taking on a malevolent awareness, its silence more menacing than any overt threat. The comfort of home was being replaced by a creeping dread. The constant low-level anxiety began to take its toll on the Millers, not just individually but as a family unit. The easy laughter that once filled their home became rarer, replaced by a strained politeness, or increasingly by short tempers. David, usually patient and calm, found himself snapping at the children over minor infractions. He was sleeping poorly, plagued by a restless energy, and the unsettling feeling that he was failing to protect his family. He threw himself into his work, seeking refuge in schematics and blueprints. But the unease followed him, a shadow he couldn't shake. Sarah too felt the strain. She tried to maintain a brave face for the children, to project an air of normalcy she was far from feeling. But her smiles felt brittle, her reassurances hollow. She found herself becoming more withdrawn, lost in thought, replaying the strange occurrences in her mind. The connection between her and David, usually so strong, felt frayed. They would lie in bed at night side by side in the darkness, each lost in their own fearful thoughts, the unspoken tension a palpable barrier between them. Communication became hesitant, guarded. Attempts to discuss the situation openly often faltered. One evening, Sarah tried. "David," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "These letters, these things happening, it's not normal, I'm scared." David, though he felt the same fear gnawing at him, reacted defensively. "We can't let our imaginations run away with us, Sarah. There has to be a logical explanation." He didn't want to admit how deeply this was affecting them. He wanted to be the protector, the one with answers, but he had none. The conversation ended there, unresolved, leaving a residue of frustration and isolation. Even the children sensed the growing fissures. Jake retreated further into his music, his guitar often the only sound emanating from his room. Emily, quieter than usual, clung more tightly to Sarah, her bright imagination now conjuring more shadows than sunshine. The facade of the happy, untroubled Miller family was beginning to crack under the relentless pressure of the unexplained. They were all walking on eggshells, careful not to voice the deepest fears that were taking root, terrified that acknowledging the full extent of the strangeness would somehow make it more real, more permanent. The following Tuesday, the fourth blank envelope arrived, devoid of any clue. Sarah retrieved it with weary resignation. The lack of escalation was unsettling. Was this a prank or a cryptic threat? The emptiness was psychological warfare, leaving them adrift in anxious uncertainty. For days the disturbances waned. A fragile hope flickered. Maybe it was over. But this quiet was deceptive, like the calm before a hurricane. Then, Emily gasped, staring at the family photo. "Mommy, who is that person?" The photo was subtly different. A shadowy figure was there that hadn't been there before. The stillness was broken. The storm had not passed. The Tuesdays continued their relentless march. Each one felt heavier than the last. The mail truck, once a symbol of connection to the outside world, now signaled only intrusion, a harbinger of that pristine white dread. Sarah Miller would feel the familiar knot tighten in her stomach as the appointed hour neared. It was a Pavlovian response now, conditioned by weeks of silent, paper-thin terror. The simple act of walking to the mailbox had transformed into a pilgrimage of fear. She knew what she would find, and that knowledge offered no comfort, only a chilling affirmation of their new, terrifying reality. The fifth envelope, then the sixth, identical, stark, empty, each one a fresh stab of unease. David tried to intercept the mail sometimes, to spare Sarah. But the dread was communal now, a sickness that had infected the entire family. He'd open it, his jaw tight, his eyes scanning the void for some hidden meaning, some infinitesimal clue. But there was nothing, just the blankness, a mocking silence that seemed to grow louder with each passing week. The empty pages were accumulating in a drawer, a growing monument to their helplessness, a testament to an unseen, unknown tormentor playing a cruel, incomprehensible game. The family's attempts at normalcy felt increasingly hollow. Dinners were quieter, the conversations strained. School and work provided temporary distractions, but the return home meant a return to the oppressive atmosphere. The empty letters cast a long shadow over everything. They were a constant, silent reminder that their lives were no longer their own, that their sanctuary had been breached by something insidious, something that offered no explanation, no demands, only a relentless, unnerving presence. The rhythm of their lives was now dictated by these Tuesday arrivals, a cycle of dread and anxious anticipation. Young Emily started to mark Tuesdays on her calendar with a little black X, not in anticipation, but in grim acknowledgement. Jake, more withdrawn than ever, would often just shrug when another letter arrived, a gesture of feigned indifference that barely masked his underlying fear. The Millers were trapped in their beautiful home on Elm Street, trapped by a mystery that offered no clues, only an escalating sense of vulnerability. The Tuesday infection was spreading, its tendrils wrapping tightly around their sanity, squeezing the hope from their hearts, and the worst, they suspected, was yet to come. The subtle disturbances in the house began to sharpen, to take on a more overtly sinister edge. It was no longer just a misplaced book or a rearranged spice rack. The changes were becoming more personal, more deeply unsettling. One evening, as Sarah tidied the living room, her gaze fell upon the mantelpiece. A collection of framed family photographs stood there, chronicling years of happy memories. Or so she thought. She picked up a photo of Jake, taken on his 10th birthday, a wide, gap-toothed grin on his face. But something was wrong, terribly wrong. Behind Jake, lurking in the slightly blurred background, was a face. It was a pale face, indistinct, but undeniably there, a face that did not belong. It hadn't been there before, Sarah was certain of it. Her blood ran cold. She snatched up another photo, one of her and David on their anniversary, smiling into the camera. And there it was again. A different face this time older, more gaunt, peering out from the shadows behind them. Her breath hitched. These were not tricks of the light, these were alterations. Deliberate, impossible changes to their most cherished memories. As if an unseen artist was repainting their past, inserting spectral, unwelcome guests into their happiest moments. When she showed David, his initial reaction was disbelief. He took the photos holding them under the brightest light, examining them with a magnifying glass. He spoke of optical illusions of the power of suggestion, but the evidence was there, undeniable and chilling. More photos were checked. A wedding picture. Emily's first day of school. Each one, they now discovered, contained a subtle, shadowy interloper. A new face, sometimes partially obscured, sometimes disconcertingly clear, staring out from the periphery. The family albums, once sources of joy and nostalgia, now felt like galleries of impending doom. The children were terrified. Jake refused to even look at the altered photographs after his first glimpse. Emily wept, asking who these strange people were and why they were in their pictures. How could this be happening? It defied all logic, all reason. The empty letters were one thing, a passive, silent torment, but this was an active violation, a desecration of their identity, their history. The fear in the Miller house ratcheted up, becoming a palpable entity. The feeling of being watched now had faces. Unfamiliar, unwelcome faces smiling faintly from the glossy surfaces of their captured lives. The inanimate objects in the Miller home continued their strange dance, but now with a bolder, more unsettling choreography. It wasn't just small items anymore. One morning, they came downstairs to find the heavy oak dining table, which normally sat squarely in the center of the dining room, shifted several feet to the left, one corner now awkwardly jutting into the doorway. It would have taken considerable effort to move it. No one admitted to touching it. No one could have, they reasoned, without waking the others. The sheer impossibility of it sent fresh waves of fear through the family. Their family dog, Buster, a usually boisterous golden retriever, began to behave erratically. Buster, who loved nothing more than a belly rub and a game of fetch, became withdrawn and anxious. He would often stand at the foot of the stairs, whining softly, his gaze fixed on the empty landing above, hackles slightly raised. Sometimes he would growl at empty corners of a room, a low guttural sound that sent shivers down their spines. He refused to enter certain rooms altogether, rooms he had previously frequented without issue. His fear was a mirror reflecting their own, an animal instinct signaling a danger they could not see. Then came the incident with the grandfather clock in the hallway. It was an antique, a family heirloom that had ticked faithfully for generations. One afternoon, its rhythmic ticking abruptly stopped. David, assuming it simply needed winding, opened the clock face. Inside, nestled amongst the gears and weights, was a child's toy soldier, one that hadn't belonged to Jake or Emily. It was old, made of tin, its paint chipped. Where had it come from? How had it gotten inside the sealed clock? The silence of the stopped clock felt more ominous than its steady ticking ever had. These were not subtle shifts anymore. These were blatant manipulations of their environment. The house itself seemed to be colluding with the unseen sender of the empty letters. It was as if the walls were breathing, the furniture rearranging itself at will, the very air thick with an unseen intelligence. The Millers felt like puppets in a play orchestrated by a malevolent, invisible director. Their sense of security was not just fractured, it was shattered. The familiar had become alien, their sanctuary a stage for the bizarre and the terrifying. Buster's unease was perhaps the most telling. Animals, they say, sense things humans cannot. The mounting fear and the inexplicable events began to fray the bonds within the Miller family. The shared terror, instead of uniting them, started to create fissures. Suspicion, unspoken but present, flickered in their eyes. Could one of them be doing this? As a prank? Or worse, had one of them succumbed to some hidden madness? David found himself watching Jake more closely, wondering if teenage angst had taken a dark, elaborate turn. Sarah, in her most private, terrified moments, even questioned David's late nights at the office. These were thoughts she immediately banished, ashamed, but they were there, insidious seeds planted by the relentless strangeness. Arguments became more frequent, triggered by the slightest provocation. The constant tension was a tinderbox, and any spark, a forgotten chore, a misplaced word, could ignite it. "Why aren't you doing more?" Sarah might snap at David, her voice tight with fear and exhaustion. "What do you expect me to do?" he would retort, his own helplessness fueling his frustration. "Call the police? And tell them what? That we're getting empty letters and our photos are changing? The sheer absurdity of their situation made finding solutions or even solace impossible. They were isolated in their terror, unable to articulate it to the outside world. The children too were showing the strain in different ways. Emily became increasingly clingy, shadowing Sarah around the house, her small face etched with a constant worry. She had nightmares filled with blank pages and shadowy figures. Jake, on the other hand, retreated further into himself, his music becoming louder, angrier. He spent hours locked in his room, the heavy beat a barricade against the encroaching fear. He scoffed at any attempts to discuss what was happening, his bravado a thin veil over his own terror. The family dynamic, once warm and supportive, was becoming strained, distorted by the weight of the unknown. Sleep offered no escape. The nights were long, filled with an anxious wakefulness, every creak of the house amplified, every shadow a potential threat. They would lie in bed, listening, waiting. For what, they didn't know. The fear was a constant companion, a cold presence in their home. It whispered doubts, fueled anxieties, and slowly, insidiously, began to erode their trust in each other, in their own sanity. The reflections they saw in the mirror seemed subtly altered, their eyes hollowed by sleeplessness and a creeping dread that was becoming a permanent resident in the Miller household. The changes grew bolder, as if their tormentor was testing them. One afternoon, Sarah found every cabinet door and drawer wide open. The message was clear: I can go anywhere. The house no longer felt like their own, it felt controlled by an invisible hand. The house seemed to have developed its own malevolent consciousness. Even the family pet, Buster, seemed to be on the verge of a breakdown. He began to snarl viciously at the empty armchair, as if confronting an unseen intruder. The empty letters continued, each one a fresh seal on their nightmare. The Millers were living in a state of siege from something far more terrifying, the unknown. It felt like an active participant watching them as an unseen hand tightened its grip. The Millers could no longer exist as passive victims. A desperate resolve began to harden within David. They would fortify their home, turning it into a fortress. The following weekend was consumed by determined labor. Basement windows were secured with iron bars. Their next line of defense was technology. Cameras would surely capture it. David purchased a dozen, placing them at strategic points, even one pointed directly at the mailbox. But the cameras saw nothing, and with it, another pristine white envelope in the mailbox. The cameras recorded its discovery, but never its delivery. It was a mocking testament to the uselessness of their efforts. Their fortress had been breached, effortlessly. With their own attempts proving futile, the Millers faced calling the police. Sarah, her hand trembling, finally made the call, trying to make sense of the insensible. A police cruiser pulled up to their home. Officer Miller listened to David and Sarah recount their ordeal. His skepticism was palpable. He found no signs of forced entry. Then, with a polite nod, he was gone. The visit had yielded nothing but a deeper sense of isolation. The very next Tuesday, another white envelope lay waiting in their mailbox. It felt like a silent declaration that it was beyond the reach of law. You are alone. With no solace from the law, they turned to their neighbors, desperate for answers. They had to know if the strangeness in their home had cast ripples into Harmony Creek. But suffering in silence was unbearable. They needed a witness. The conversations were awkward and fruitless. Each denial chipped away at their hope. Harmony Creek was wrapped in normalcy, unaware of the terror within the Miller house. Their nightmare was self-contained, visible only to them. This isolation became a new torment. No one validated their fear. The empty letters continued, the house transformed, leaving the Millers utterly alone. Weeks of unexplained terror left the Millers frayed and sleepless. Every sound, every shadow sent their nerves into overdrive. Sarah and David questioned their own perceptions, doubting memories and even each other. Tension seeped into every conversation, suspicion lurking beneath the surface. The house itself seemed to amplify their distress, turning silence into suffocating dread. Tears and tempers flared. The children withdrew, the family unraveling. Their home, once a sanctuary, had become a crucible for their sanity. The house began to change in impossible ways. Windows shrank, hallways narrowed, ceilings pressed down. David and Sarah compared blueprints to reality. Nothing matched. Doorways shifted, walls thickened, the house was rewriting itself. This was no longer a haunting but a fundamental warping of reality. The Millers realized their very existence was under siege. The empty letters and shifting objects were only the beginning. They stood on the edge of an abyss, their world coming undone. Desperate, the Millers re-examined every clue, searching for meaning. The evidence mocked them. Blank letters, warped photos, broken blueprints. Emily, quiet and observant, noticed something the adults missed. She felt a bump on one of the blank pages. Under magnification, a faint symbol appeared, a tiny bird within a circle. It was the first tangible clue, hidden in plain sight. For the first time, hope flickered. A crack in the wall of silence. The family clung to this discovery, desperate for answers. The darkness had left a mark, and now they had something to follow. The symbol became their obsession. Research revealed it belonged to Blackwood Paper, a mill closed decades ago after strange events. The mill's history was shrouded in superstition and disappearances. The clue didn't bring comfort, only deeper fear. Their tormentor was tied to something ancient and sinister. The letter's emptiness now hinted at a legacy of darkness. The Millers realized they faced not just a haunting but a curse rooted in forgotten despair. Their fear now had a name, and it was far older than they imagined. The horror turned personal. Family photos began to change their own faces, subtly twisted, blurred, or fading. Sarah's wedding photo, Jake's school picture, each image corrupted their identities, eroding. The Millers scrutinized each other, terrified of what they might see. The message was clear, even their memories weren't safe. The entity was erasing them piece by piece. Their very existence was under attack, and the erasure had only begun. One morning Jake was gone. No trace, no note, nothing. Panic swept the house, every room searched, every call unanswered. In the family photos, Jake had vanished completely, as if he'd never existed. Only faint outlines hinted at his absence. The Millers realized the true horror. Their tormentor could erase them from reality itself. Jake was the first to disappear, but the threat loomed over them all. The house had claimed its first victim. The question was no longer if, but who would be next. Then, as inexplicably as it had all begun, it stopped. One Tuesday arrived, bathed in the same ordinary sunlight. Mr. Henderson delivered the mail, smiled, waved, and moved on. There was no stark white envelope, no silent, empty threat. A fragile, disbelieving silence settled over the Miller house. The house itself seemed to sigh, though its scars remained. Their home was a museum of their trauma. Jake was gone, erased not just from their home, but from their recorded history. How does one mourn a person who has been so completely, supernaturally unmade? The Millers were left alone with their knowledge, their scars, leaving behind only devastation and the deafening silence of its departure. Years passed, but for the Millers the echo of Jake's erasure would never fade. The house would forever symbolize their ordeal. The bird emblem, a chilling reminder of the dark undercurrents they'd brushed against. Did they dare investigate or leave that stone unturned, terrified of what horrors might lie beneath? The source of their torment remained unknown, a faceless entity with power over their lives. The world was now viewed through a terrifying lens. How could they ever feel secure again when reality had proven so malevolent? They were forever marked, set apart by a secret they could never escape. Had something fundamental shifted within them? Had the entity that erased one of their own changed them too? The terror had been within them, a constant, corrosive presence. Did the real Miller family ever return from that abyss? Are they the living embodiment of the darkness, forever altered? A testament to the empty letter and the horror it unleashed. Only the cold, lingering touch of the void remained.